The 1986 Iran-Contra affair revealed that President Ronald Reagan's administration had secretly negotiated arms for hostages deals with Iran, discrediting Reagan's claim that he would not negotiate with terrorists. The Reagan administration also supported Saddam Hussein, who was the president of Iraq in the 1980 through 1988 Iran-Iraq War. The administration provided logistical and intelligence support, believing wrongly that Saddam could destabilize the Iranian regime and defeat the Islamic Revolution. Hussein engaged chemical warfare against Iran, including civilians. This event almost ran congruent with the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan in late 1979. Bin Laden began providing financial and logistical support to the Islamic fighters battling the Soviets. In 1988, after Soviet forces were defeated and withdrew from Afghanistan, Bin Laden founded an organization called Al-Qaeda, or the Base, to continue the cause of jihad, holy war, through violence and aggression. Saudi Arabia and the US also supplied billions of dollars of secret assistance to rebel groups and warlords inside Afghanistan. When the Soviets were forced out, powerful armies were left behind. The Reagan administration, bringing the Soviet Union to its knees in the attitude of Reagan's America, made it the defender of the world, which really catapulted us into the Middle East. Under George H.W. Bush, Desert Shield became Operation Desert Storm when Bush shifted strategy from defending Saudi Arabia to repelling Iraq from Kuwait, ostensibly because Saddam might, Bush claimed, be developing nuclear weapons. A coalition of 30 nations joined American forces in a military operation that numbered more than 500,000 troops. An additional 18 countries supplied economic and humanitarian aid, also known as the Gulf War, lasting from August 2, 1990 to February 28, 1991. The loss of infrastructure in Iraq due to the airstrikes from America and its allies, along with U.S. intervention in Afghanistan and Palestine to aid Israel, made bin Laden continue to assert that the U.S. was the enemy. Besides mediating the 1994 peace treaty between Israel and Jordan, which guaranteed Jordan the restoration of its occupied land and an equitable share of water from the Yarmouk and Jordan rivers, which is still in effect but did not stop the violence. President Bill Clinton's involvement in the Middle East was bracketed by the short-lived success of the paired Oslo Accords, one in August 1993, another in 1995. And the collapse of the Camp David Summit in December 2000. Yet another failed attempt at getting recognition for Israel's modern existence. It is pretty incredible, though, that one president could have facilitated this multiple times. After deriding operations involving the U.S. military in what he called nation building, President George W. Bush turned after the terrorist attack of September 11, 2001, into the most ambitious nation builder since the days of Secretary of State George Marshall, who helped rebuild Europe after World War II. But Bush's efforts focused on the Middle East were not very successful. Bush had the world's backing when he led an attack on Afghanistan in October 2001 to topple the Taliban regime, which had given sanctuary to Al-Qaeda, the terrorist group responsible for the 9/11 attacks. Bush's expansion of the War on Terror to Iraq in March 2003, however, had far less international support. Bush saw the toppling of Saddam Hussein as the first step in the domino-like birth of democracy in the Middle East. But while Bush talked democracy in regard to Iraq and Afghanistan, he continued to support repressive, undemocratic regimes in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and several countries in North Africa.
Hello, my name is Tyler Elker, and I'm going to be handling the moral and ethical dilemmas surrounding the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and as well as the 9/11 attacks. First, I'm going to talk about the actual plane itself that happened on September 11th. This attack happened under the Bush administration in 2001, after he was less than a year in his office, and Dick Cheney was Bush's vice president. This attack marked a huge chain in U.S. foreign policy, as well as the morals in which this attack happened, which I am going to talk about in this next segment. However, it's important to note that Dick Cheney ordered that planes or U.S. fighters shoot down any planes that headed to the Capitol, which really strained how much the vice president had matters within military internal affairs, and just the entire awe of the event that changed how all Americans perceived the future for the next 20 years. The attack that took place on 9/11 was actually very calculated. The mastermind behind the attacks on 9/11 was bin Laden, who had trained the terrorists, but it is important to note how this actually happened. During this time, and as well as in the 1990s, airport security was not concerned with contraband and smugglers. Metal detectors were beginning to be used in the 90s and were actually invented. However, they were not implemented on a large scale. There were screeners, however, these were easy to smuggle in as metal was not able to be detected under certain clothing. The attackers used box cutters, which weren't detectable by these screeners, and used them to hijack the planes. No one considered high-risk passengers to go on suicide missions because no one had ever done this before. Other dilemmas surrounding the attacks on 9/11 is how pilots were actually trained to handle these hijackers. So the cockpits actually weren't secured because no one had ever done this before. When hijackers took control of the plane, the pilots were ordered to give in to the hijackers' demands, land at a designated location, and have law enforcement arrive. This would prevent any further escalation and violence inside the plane. So the fact that they were crashed into the World Trade Center caught the pilots completely off guard. And this was the first official attack on mainland soil since Pearl Harbor, or more technically, since the War of 1812. Next, I'm going to be talking about the moral and ethical dilemmas surrounding the invasion of Iraq as well as Afghanistan. After the attack of 9/11, one of the moral dilemmas is that Islamophobia rose within the United States and affected the majority of the Muslim population within America and is still relevant today. The number attributed to this is that 60% of Americans reported unfavorable attitudes toward Muslims after 9/11, and this started within the 90s after the attacks on a parking lot within the World Trade Center, as well as just the increase of terrorist attacks within the United States. Post 9/11 also initiated the global war on terror that would dominate the beginning of the 21st century and dominate United States foreign policy for the next 20 years. Terrorist attacks would also increase during this time, and the Middle East would become a hot zone for proxy wars. The numbers attributed to these wars would be within the hundreds of thousands. And the deaths as a result of post 9/11 wars, including Yemen, Afghanistan, and Iraq, are estimated between 770,000 and 801,000 deaths. First, I'm going to talk about the ethical dilemmas surrounding the invasion of Iraq by the United States. First of all, this marked a very dangerous escalation and false pretense for the Americans' use of global power as well as being a leader of the free world. This conflict led to the thousands of Iraqi deaths, including the deaths of military, soldiers, and civilians. While Saddam Hussein was a tyrannical dictator, there was no evidence for the use, there was no evidence of weapons of mass destruction being developed or being owned by Saddam Hussein's regime, which was the pretense for the invasion of Iraq under the Bush administration. While Saddam Hussein did use chemical weapons on civilians and military forces within the Iran-Iraq war, all chemical weapons had ceased production and there were no nuclear devices being developed. And all weapons of mass destruction development actually had been ceased under orders of Saddam Hussein. The removal of Saddam Hussein from Iraq led to the military, social, and political collapse of Iraq and led to a sprout of terrorism that would later be known as the group called ISIS. The U.S. would also have a constant presence within Iraq for the next 20 years, and we are still there today. And the occupation of Iraq shows no sign of ending. Moving on, I am going to talk about the moral and ethical dilemmas about the war in Afghanistan. This was considered to be a new kind of war, which I am going to explain. This was considered to be a new kind of war due to the fact that all of the combatants within this conflict, involving the Taliban at least, were wearing civilian clothing and were using civilian machinery. Now, while they did have old Soviet-era weapons, all of these were fought within civilian sectors. They could blend into civilian populations. They could blend in wearing what the civilians were wearing, and you could have no idea who was the enemy and who was a civilian, which marked a very dangerous time for the United States. And while we were a technological power, we were not able to fight this level of insurgency, and that as a result, this would lead on for the next 20 years, and the eventual withdrawal of all United States troops following the evacuation at Kabul airport.
After deriding operations involving the U.S. military in what he called nation building, President George W. Bush turned after the terrorist attack of September 11, 2001, into the most ambitious nation builder since the days of Secretary of State George Marshall, who helped rebuild Europe after World War II. But Bush's efforts focused on the Middle East were not very successful. Bush had the world's backing when he led an attack on Afghanistan in October 2001 to topple the Taliban regime, which had given sanctuary to Al-Qaeda, the terrorist group responsible for the 9/11 attacks. Bush's expansion of the war on terror to Iraq in March 2003, however, had far less international support. Bush saw the toppling of Saddam Hussein as the first step in the domino-like birth of democracy in the Middle East. But while Bush talked democracy in regard to Iraq and Afghanistan, he continued to support repressive, undemocratic regimes in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and several countries in North Africa.
So, concluding the historical contextual evaluation of Afghanistan and the Iraq War, for Iraq, ISIS-K has been suppressed but is currently not destroyed. For Afghanistan, we have seen the complete withdrawal of U.S. troops in a complete Taliban takeover. Many Americans right now are wondering if the occupation of Iraq will ever end, or the occupation of the Middle East. Many Americans also wonder if the Afghan war was even worth it, as we've seen the amount of money that was spilled into this conflict, as well as Iraq, and the ongoing trouble of the global war on terror, and whether the pursuit of governing the Middle East is even worth it at this point.
1 Peter 3:9 says, "Do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless, for to this you were called, that you may obtain a blessing." Not to say anything about 9/11 can be justified, but from the lens of bin Laden's Al-Qaeda, it was partly carried out due to revenge for America's constant meddling in the Middle East, which also resulted in civilian casualties, if not directly, then indirectly as well. But America acted like the enemy sent the first strike and retaliated as such. Not to say a retaliation wasn't necessary, but from a morally biblical perspective, George W. Bush could have taken a more ethical approach.
When also looking at a biblical critique about the United States' actions within Afghanistan and Iraq, I am using Romans 12 and 13 as my basis. Regarding this, the United States, though justified in its cause against terrorism, undermined and failed to reach its ultimate goal of driving terrorism from the Middle East. As a nation, we should have strived to love the Afghan and Iraqi people instead of fearing them and trying to control them and the Muslim people, and also take a better understanding of those who actually lost their lives and those who now live under the terror we fought so hard to destroy. We should have been there to create a common good for the people, not just nation building, and not as enforcers or deliverers, but bringing freedom in a way that would create a safe Middle East and not in a state where it was worse off than when we arrived, especially in Afghanistan. We should not be the ones who adhere justice as vigilantes or a rogue nation, and instead heed the call of all nations with the common goal of helping countries struggling with Islamic extremism. My name is Tyler Elker, and thank you for watching.
This can be a sore and complicated subject, but an important one to understand from all angles. To those of you who chose to watch, thank you, and I hope this video finds you well and the information presented is as useful to you as it was to Tyler and I. We also want to wish you the best of luck as we approach finals.